Hey, what's up, kids? I'll tell you what's up. New 3050 Inner Sphere Mech rating video. I know you are all excited. Which actually you should be excited because it turns out we're doing the letter G, and it turns out that the letter G is an extremely high-powered letter. I'm not sure why this is, but strap yourselves in. So the first letter G mech is probably the worst letter G mech, which is the Goliath GOL3M. Now this thing, it starts out, you go down this sheet and everything looks pretty good. You've got solid armor, pretty good speed, XL engine, okay, not the best, but not the worst either. Heatsink coverage is more than satisfactory for the weapons. You got a solid long-range arsenal of weapons. Okay. And then you get down and there's only 8 shots of Gauss rifle ammunition. Uh-oh. So this thing doesn't have what it takes to sustain a barrage from its main weapon over the course of a game. That makes it pretty weak. You could potentially take it and just fire the Gauss rifle for 8 turns, and then you've got another 4 turns of LRM shooting, but honestly this makes the mech pretty bad, especially for the pretty high battle value cost you're paying for it. So, I mean, it's not terrible. It's definitely something that's hard to take down. It's not an absolute disaster, but that lack of Gauss rifle ammunition makes it pretty weak. So fortunately for us, the Merrick mech makers just turned around and built a variant that solved that problem, the Goliath 3M2. It removes the machine guns, puts in small pulse lasers, so you've got a really much improved situation. You have no more vulnerability from that machine gun ammunition on the one hand, and on the other hand you've got double the Gauss rifle ammo, so this thing can sustain a barrage throughout the game. So this mech is solid. You know, you would have liked a little more firepower, especially since you are putting a Gauss rifle on top of an extra light engine, which, as we all know, makes the mech vulnerable. If you hit that Gauss rifle, the mech is going to die pretty much. But still, the armor is solid. You've got excellent offensive firepower. I guess the one real weakness that the mech still has is that it's prioritized its rear armor too much. This is a long-range sniper. You don't need 13 points of rear armor on the side torsos. You definitely don't need 19 points of rear armor on the center torso. So that's just a little too much rear armor. That's the real problem that remains with this mech. So next we've got something kind of cool in that its capabilities are pretty unique. You know, you could compare this mech to a Lancelot perhaps, but it really is quite different from a Lancelot still. Anyway, this is the Grand Dragon 5K. You've got 6.9 speeds, so extremely fast, fastest it can go at its weight. And it's got pretty much a long-range sniper arsenal with an ERPPC and an LRM-10. So you can really try to kite a lot of opponents with this mech. If you were doing something like a one-on-one duel or something, I would say that makes this mech a pretty strong choice if you're willing to let the game go real long. One weakness is that 2 of the 3 medium lasers are in the rear arc. That's not so strong. Also, the armor isn't that solid. 10 tons, a lot less than the maximum you could take. So that's not ideal, especially since the mech kind of overloads on heat sinks. But if you want something that is this fast and this long ranged, there's not really any other alternatives in this period. And for that reason alone, I think the Grand Dragon 5K is a really interesting design that deserves your notice. Again, I'll just say the mech probably has a little too much rear armor. Another variant from this period, the Grand Dragon C, which takes off a rear medium laser and puts on a C3 computer, is probably superior just because it's going to be a little bit more battle value cheap without that rear medium laser, and who really wants a rear medium laser on this thing? If you're going to use it in a C3 lance, of course, it's a lot stronger, although I'm not sure this is an ideal mech to include in a C3 lance, because I don't think you need your long-range mechs in a C3 lance to be speed demons like the Grand Dragon. You know, the advantage of a mech that combines speed with long-range firepower is that you can play the range brackets and really get yourself to the exact right range. For example, to give yourself medium range and your opponent long range or something like that. but with C3, it's going to reduce the need for you to do that. So I'm not sure that the Grand Dragon C, especially if you're playing for battle value, is really the ideal choice. So now we've got the quote-unquote upgraded Grasshopper, the 5J. This thing is actually a downgrade because it gets rid of 2 of the 4 medium lasers, which was just the core of this mech's arsenal. And it switches the large laser to an ER large laser, which you don't really need on this short-ranged mech. That said, the Grasshopper started out from a position of being extremely strong. So what you end up with is something that is not great, but definitely not terrible. At about 1350 battle value, you've got a cost that's similar to a 3025 Thunderbolt, and this thing isn't that much worse than a 3025 Thunderbolt. So this mech is much maligned, and rightly so, because it is a downgrade, but it is actually playable, I think. And then the Grasshopper also has a C variant, which is a real upgrade because it gets rid of a useless ton of Streak SRM2 ammunition that was just increasing the mech's vulnerability. So that's a nice one. Okay, now we're getting into some Griffins. Now the Griffin is a bittersweet mech for me because I think that the mech in many of its variants is really excellent and I love the looks of it, but it really suffers from the battle value system because Griffins tend to be long-ranged and fairly speedy and jumpy, and battle value really punishes mechs with that combination of traits. The first Griffin we're going to look at is weak, even disregarding all that stuff I said about battle value. We've got a large pulse laser and an LRM-20. These are both excellent weapons, but they don't combine with each other very well. And the armor is weak in some weird ways. Same amount on the center torso versus the side torsos. That's not really that ideal. So this mech has some significant weaknesses, and I would not be inclined to take it in any game if you have good alternatives. Now the 3M, on the other hand, if you just look at its capabilities, is one of the strongest mechs of the 3050 period, and if I had the chance to kind of add it to my force in any campaign game, I would do so in a second. It improves that center torso armor, and it also has an ERPPC instead of the large pulse laser, much more of kind of a standard Griffin's loadout. So this thing has a really nice long-range specialist arsenal. That 585 speed to get yourself into ideal firing positions, together with an arsenal that's very likely to cause a piloting skill roll if you hit with both weapons at long range. This is a very nice long-range sniper with mobility. But like I said, the battle value system punishes mechs like that, and so you end up with something that has a battle value where you could afford some lower-end assault mechs instead of this thing. So is it worth taking in a battle value balanced game? Not usually. And finally, when it comes to Griffins, we have one of these WoW mechs, which is kind of a retcon mech that wasn't originally in Tech Readout 3050, but does become available around 3050. The Griffin 3RG, which is the Royal Guard variant of the Griffin, although weirdly, it is also available to mercenaries according to the master unit list. But the primary users of this mech are the House Steiner Royal Guards, and this thing is crazy. It's, a 5.8 mover, so a solid speed for a 55-ton mech, and then it just loads on the pulse lasers. Well, we all know there's not much that's better than a pulse laser boat, especially if it has the mobility to get up close and wreck things, which it does. So I've played against this mech in a tournament setting, and it's really dangerous. You do not want to ignore it. You want to focus your fire on it and get it out of there. Also note that the engine is a standard fusion engine, so it's got some more resilience than those Griffins that we've looked at previously here. So this thing is a beast, okay? Be scared of this mech. And the battle value is so cheap, 1,200 for this kind of insane pulse laser boat. Yeah, I mean, this is a highly competitive mech in a tournament setting. And then we've got one last G mech to look at, and it's just awesome, the Guillotine 5M. It's like a standard Star League Guillotine, but it gets you an ER large laser instead of a standard large laser. So the heat is a little bit more of a problem than it is on the standard Guillotine, but on the other hand, that range can come in really useful. So I wouldn't necessarily rate this above or below a standard Guillotine. I think it's just a compromise that you make to put on that extended range large laser. There's a lot of situations where it'll be better. There's a lot of situations where it'll be worse. But the basic point is that the Guillotine is a tough guy. Think of this as being like a Grasshopper, except this one isn't a downgrade of the original. The armor is a little bit less solid than a Grasshopper's armor, but then the weapons are a little bit of an improvement since you have a short-range missile launcher that is good in size instead of the Streak 2 missile launcher on the upgraded Grasshopper or the LRM-5 launcher on the basic original Grasshopper. So this is a mech where the offensive firepower works out a little bit better than the Grasshoppers, the defenses work out a little bit less well than the Grasshoppers, and on the whole it just kind of comes together really well. The Guillotine is a solid choice for a brawler and for a close range backstabber to jump into the rear arc of like an enemy assault mech, for example. The armor placement is really good. So yeah, I do not have very many complaints at all about this mech, and it's just a solid A rating, which is really unusual for this 30-50 period. So bottom line, if you're looking for a competitive mech in the 30-50 period, look to the letter G in your record sheet book, because that's where a lot of the great ones are. All right, talk to you guys next time. Have a good one.